Well, good morning, and thank you, Paul and Ina, for inviting me to speak today and for organizing this event. I'll talk for a little over 20 minutes, and then I promise not much more than 20 minutes, and then we'll look forward to our discussion. And thank you so much for your many pertinent questions that you've just raised. You might be surprised to learn that a prominent Nazi theologian continues to enjoy widespread legitimacy in mainstream Protestantism today, 80 years after the Holocaust and the collapse of the Third Reich. That's my topic today, and the thought and legacy of Nazi theologian Emanuel Hirsch, whose dates were 1888 to 1972. As part of Hirsch's legacy, I will also discuss a 1963 paper by his follower, Ernst Haenchen. But let me start with my personal connection to this subject matter. I'm a fourth-generation descendant of Baptist clergy. My study of biblical languages and literature at Harvard Divinity School convinced me that the fundamentalist belief system that I inherited was untenable. For example, I learned to understand Jesus in his Jewish context and to read both the Hebrew and Christian scriptures within their original historical contexts. The liberal Protestant and secular traditions I first encountered at Harvard, however, had problematic baggage of their own. I later learned, for example, that Gerhard Kittel, one of the German scholars who had done so much to restore Jesus to his Jewish context, also viewed post-biblical Judaism as degenerate and became a leading Nazi theologian. My doctoral research at Columbia University and Union Theological Seminary here in New York uncovered further connections between liberal academia and the German right. The controversy and repressive tactics with which my research was greeted, which became the subject of a major academic scandal in the 1990s, made it clear to me that fundamentalists have no monopoly on authoritarianism. My research was eventually published by a peer-reviewed press under the title God and Caesar, with a foreword by Cornel West. My topic today sheds light on Alternative for Germany, the AfD, the leading far-right party in that country today, and which embraces a sophisticated right-wing ideology comparable to that of many mainstream German churches and universities before, during, and after the Third Reich. With AfD, this element in German culture is now simply taking the form of an explicitly political movement. With this background, let us now turn to the topic at hand. I begin with Emanuel Hirsch himself in his own historical context and then examine his continuing legacy in mainstream Protestantism. So part one of my presentation, Emanuel Hirsch, the Third Reich, and German Protestantism. Emanuel Hirsch was a leader of the Deutsche Christen, or the German Christians, as the pro-Hitler wing of German Protestantism called itself. The story of the Deutsche Christen is unfamiliar and even shocking to most Americans due to what historian Shelley Baranowski called the myth of resistance that arose after World War II. In this conventional view, pastors such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller, leaders of the confessing church that resisted Hitler, are seen as typical of German Protestantism under the Third Reich. In reality, such heroes were a small minority. By making them the face of the German Protestant church, Western elites conveniently legitimized West Germany as part of the US-led Cold War alliance. It is also widely assumed that the Nazis eschewed Christianity and embraced paganism. As in the case of some of Richard Wagner's operas, however, we will see that Hirsch invoked German feudal traditions that blended Christian and pagan elements seamlessly. Now, Emanuel Hirsch grew up in a German Lutheran pastor's home. The family was politically very loyal to the German state. Emanuel volunteered for service in World War I, but was rejected as physically unfit. He was not even accepted to serve as chaplain. So Hirsch was, according to his biographer, small and sickly all of his life. Unlike Donald Trump with his bone spurs excuses, Hirsch was not looking for a way to avoid service. Sorry about my video. Apologize here. Okay. So now, unlike Donald Trump with his bone spurs excuse, Hirsch was not looking for a way to avoid service. On the contrary, writing in his journal, he mourned that he could not serve as he listened to the sound of German soldiers excitedly marching off. It seems plausible that Hirsch was compensating for being a so-called physical weakling. He described his own typewriter as a feminine apparatus, as an effective weapon of war. As dean of the theological faculty at the University of Göttingen during the Third Reich, Hirsch was, quote, demanding, waspish, and contentious toward his colleagues, unquote. Biographer Robert Erickson described in detail how Dean Hirsch argued with and bullied faculty who did not toe the Nazi Party line 100%. Finally, Hirsch was, quote, sensitive to the widespread rumor that he was Jewish. His name implied that possibility, and he was thought to look Jewish, unquote. Like many others building their careers in Nazi Germany, he provided a detailed genealogy of both sides of his family, dating back as far as 8 generations. Now, after the war, Professor Hirsch chose to retire rather than go through the denazification program established by the Nazis, but he continued publishing and met with students in his home. In 1963, on his 75th birthday, again, 1963, considerably after World War II, the still unrepentant former Nazi was honored with a Festschrift entitled Wahrheit und Glaube, or Truth and Faith. By the way, I found a copy of it in the Union Theological Seminary library here, which is affiliated with Columbia University, New York City. No problem getting a hold of this primary source. Okay, so he was honored with a Festschrift entitled Wahrheit und Glaube, or Truth and Faith. In the second part of this paper, I discuss Ernst Haenchen's contribution to this Festschrift. Other contributors were founding members of the Ernst Haenchen Society, which keeps Hirsch's legacy alive in German Protestantism today. While recognizing Hirsch to be a staunch Nazi, prominent biographer Robert Erickson does not have an ideological critique of Hirsch's theology. Noting Hirsch's acceptance of humanistic criticism of the Bible, Erickson classifies him theologically with Paul Tillich and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, both of whom actively opposed Hitler. Erickson concludes that, quote, none of these reactionary elements in Hirsch's politics necessarily determined his theological stance, unquote. Now, what I find odd about this view, that Hirsch's theology was independent of his politics, is that Hirsch was a systematic theologian whose political and anthropological ideas were an integral part of his system. Indeed, 1 year after the 1963 Festschrift, eminent biblical scholar William F. Albright wrote that Hirsch and his fellow Nazi theologians had the, quote, grim distinction of making extermination of the Jews theologically respectable, unquote. Erickson considers this condemnation to be unduly harsh, but my own assessment aligns with Albright's. Now, at a time when every professor of theology in Germany was pressured to join the Nazi Party, Hirsch brought Christian teaching into full alignment with the Nazi agenda. This is nowhere more apparent than in Hirsch's 1934 manifesto, Deutsches Volkstum und evangelische Glaube, or translated German folk and evangelical faith. Note that the word evangelical in this context refers to the mainstream German church and has nothing to do with the American meaning of the word. In this section, I will paraphrase this work, where Hirsch explicitly addresses the question, Hitler's God or the Christian God? In my unabridged paper, which hopefully you've read, I gave a more complete summary of Hirsch's manifesto, which for reasons of time, I'll only review briefly here. Hirsch begins by engaging Protestant critics of the Nazi movement and invokes Martin Luther as a German nationalist precursor of his own theology. The universal God, he says, becomes manifest both in the activity of the Nazi movement and in the revelation of Jesus Christ. It is this second mode of revelation that raises the divine manifestation in the German folk to a universal level that transcends mere paganism. Notwithstanding this universality of God, however, Hirsch in other writings presents a complicated theory purporting to show that the historical Jesus was racially an Aryan. He then relates his Nazi Christian concept of God to the ethos of German feudalism. Answering Nietzsche's argument that Christianity is a slave religion, he redefines the subordination of evangelical Christians as manly and honorable, akin to the subordination of a knight or a vassal to a feudal lord. In being open to everyone who accepts the gospel, however, doesn't Christianity necessarily end up admitting degenerate peoples? Hirsch replies that inferior people have a place as servants in the divinely ordained scheme of things. Thus, he dismisses individualism and democracy, viewing the folk community and Christian society not as a community of equals, but of leaders and followers. Hirsch then turns to Nietzsche's criticism of the Christian values of suffering and love. Contrary to passive and effeminate notions, Hirsch construes suffering as a form of discipline and sacrifice, a way to develop manliness, toughness, and qualities of heroism. Similarly, Christian love should not be confused with charity and welfare or relegated to men, mena, who are unpolitical and unfit for combat duty, or to women, fallen. Again, invoking feudal values, Hirsch argues that authentic Christian love is like that of a noble warrior or knight's love for the folk, and that God today has brought alive the spirit of Prussian monarchy in our Führer's nation, and the word there is Führungsstaat. Hirsch's tone, which began the section on a discursive note, ends in a rhapsody to his divinely beloved folk. Hirsch concludes the monograph by asking, what have we found? Hitler's God or the Christian God? He answers, the German folk and evangelical faith are woven together in an inseparable community of destiny. The Christian hears one and the same God, in the God of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and in the great holy storm of the present folk events. It is one God who speaks to us then and now. So this concludes my brief paraphrase of Hirsch's 1934 book, German Folk and Evangelical Faith. The seamless interweaving in this monograph of Nazi ideology and Christian faith invalidates any attempts by commentators to separate Hirsch's theology from his politics. I therefore find Robert Erickson's classification of his theology with those of Tillich and Bonhoeffer to be rather superficial and misleading, at least. Further, the ideological content of Hirsch's theology, as seen in the brief survey above, explains much about his ascendancy in the German church and theological establishment during the Third Reich. I turn now to the prestige his ideas continue to enjoy in German Protestantism after the collapse of Hitler's regime. And now part two, Haemann's gallows and the legacy of Emanuel Hirsch. After World War II, former Nazis, following the ritual purification of denazification, were typically reinstated in their previous church and university positions. Hirsch himself continued to exert considerable influence during the post-war years, despite refusing even the fig leaf of denazification. German Protestantism, for the most part, had been a bulwark against socialism and communism since the beginning of the 20th century and played this role during the Third Reich and to a large extent after it. The post-war American empire, though formally democratic at home, enlisted the support of fascist dictatorships in Europe and throughout the world. This authoritarian Cold War environment proved fertile ground for the theological ideas of Emanuel Hirsch, which is evident from the above-mentioned 1963 Festschrift. In the remainder of this paper, I will examine one of the essays in this Festschrift, entitled Haemann's Gallows and Christ's Cross, by Hirsch's contemporary Ernst Haenchen, whose dates were 1894 to 1975. While the book by Hirsch that I discussed above did not address Judaism in a developed way, Haenchen presents an interpretation of the Hebrew Bible's Book of Esther that bears directly on the Holocaust and post-war Christian-Jewish relations. Now, Ernst Haenchen was the son of a Prussian government official. Ernst began studying theology at the University of Berlin in 1914, but was soon sent to fight in World War I. In 1918, he lost his right leg in that war. After the war in 1926, he completed his studies in theology at the University of Tübingen and took a pastorate, but due to his disability, returned to the university as a lecturer. He married the daughter of a Swiss Davos minister. He went on to hold several professorships, and in 1939 joined the Nazi Party prior to becoming a full professor at the University of Münster. In 1945, he was forced to retire due to his Nazi affiliation, but as an emeritus professor, continued to teach at the University of Münster for a number of years further. His publications on the Book of Acts, which is a major book of Christian scriptures, and the Gospel of John, are still considered classics in the field of today's biblical scholarship. By way of background to Haenchen's Festschrift paper, the Book of Esther is a text that explains the origin of the holiday of Purim. It is a historical fiction in which a young Jewish woman becomes queen of Persia, and with her relative Mordecai, a high official in the Persian court, foils a plot to annihilate the Jewish population of the kingdom. Haman, the king's chief minister and architect of the plot, is executed, and in the ensuing battle between the Jews and Haman's allies, the tables are turned, and it is Haman's forces who are annihilated. In the story, Mordecai appeals to Queen Esther, whose Jewish identity was then unknown to the king, to intervene with the king on behalf of her people. Confronted by Mordecai's plea, Esther might easily have put her own comfort and safety above the plight of her fellow Jews, an especially seductive resolution given her cultural assimilation in the Persian court. But instead, she identifies with the community from which she came in their hour of need, makes herself completely vulnerable before the king, and risks everything by disclosing who she is. This willingness to sacrifice all out of love made Esther a Christ-like figure in the eyes of sympathetic Christian interpreters of the book of Esther. The fact that she triumphs in the end while Jesus was actually put to death is irrelevant from this perspective, that the essence of the matter for these interpreters is that both were willing to give up everything, even their lives, to save others. Well, Haenchen will have none of this. For him, the anguish of the queen in deciding whether to risk her life on behalf of her people is of no account, and the fact that she does not die and triumphs in the end invalidates any similarity with Jesus. For Haenchen, with his androcentric theology, the book of Esther is all about, quote, the conflict between Haman and Mordecai. Who will hang on the fantastically high gallows, the Jew or the enemy of the Jew? Quote unquote. Haenchen then goes further, creating a dichotomy and contradiction between the Jewish quote unquote materialism that he reads into the story and Christianity. By the materialistic logic he attributes to the Jews, quote, would not Jesus on the cross be the godless one receiving his just punishment, unquote? In other words, according to Haenchen, the Jews may celebrate the earthly victory of Mordecai and defeat of Haman, but Christians must reject this way of thinking. The one who ends up on the gallows or the cross is not necessarily the guilty one. Now, what's wrong with this picture? Leaving aside that the materialism Haenchen attributes to the text is a projection of his own psyche, there is something profoundly twisted here, I think. The author is correct in saying that bad things can happen to good people, but who is the victim in his view? Not the Jews, apparently, even after their recent loss of 6 million in the Nazi genocide. Rather, it's the Nazis themselves who have suffered the material defeat of World War II. Like Haman's plot in the book of Esther, their effort to annihilate the Jews, horrendous though it was, did not succeed. Instead, it was the Nazis who were annihilated. Don't internalize this defeat, Haenchen seems to be telling his fellow acolytes of Emanuel Hirsch. We are good people, and the fact that we lost the war is not a reflection on our worth or the validity of our theological ideas. We are like Haman on the gallows, or better still, like Christ on the cross. Don't succumb to the Jews' materialistic way of thinking and Victor's justice. Be true to the spiritual legacy of the Deutsche Christen and our theological leader, Emanuel Hirsch. Thus, Haenchen uses the book of Esther to rationalize former Nazis' feelings of defeat and victimization in the post-war era. While authoritarianism of the Cold War era provided fertile ground for the German religious right, the latter has continued to flourish even after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Anti-Semitism is one continuing mainstay of this ideological complex. But new scapegoats have also arisen to take the place of socialism and communism, most notably immigration and Islam, as seen in Alternatives for Germany and other far-right European political parties. I'm almost done. The psychological and political economic sources of these movements are beyond the scope of this paper, but if we've learned something from this paper about the German religious right in the 20th century, I hope such insights will help us understand and respond to similar resurgent forces confronting us today. Thank you.